Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of the Deep Crawl webinar series. My name is John Myers, and today we have a great topic and also a fantastic presenter for you. Today we're going to cover the topic of clicks, conversions, and crawls, which is fantastic, obviously tying into the Deep Crawl brand. And our presenter will need no intro. She is Product and Innovation VP at AimClear, Ms. Michelle Robbins. Thank you, Michelle, for being here today with us and taking the time.
Thank you.
Go for it, Michelle.
Oh, I didn't know if you were passing it off or not passing it off.
Welcome, and thank you for being here. I mean, Michelle, what's fantastic is it makes it sound a bit old. Michelle's been in online as long as I have, which is always nice to see somebody else has been kicking around for the time I have, and has been for around about 20 years now. So obviously a long time in the industry and seen a lot of change. And for a long time, Michelle was with Third Door Media, which is the team behind obviously fantastic SMX conferences that we all go to, and obviously Search Engine Land as well. And it's obviously all hand at these sorts of webinars. So it's fantastic to have her on board. And today we get to flip it around and actually have Michelle present rather than host, which I'm very much looking forward to the content that she has planned for us. Obviously, it's the usual format for all of you regulars that tune into the Deep Crawl webinar. Michelle's going to present for the next 30 to 35 minutes, and obviously we'll follow that up with Q&A. So please, please, please do submit those questions via the chat box as normal on the right-hand side of your screen. We like to get in through past the presentation, obviously, and have a nice run of questions ready to go, and get all those, I'm sure, things that you guys will want answering about what Michelle's about to present to us. As normal, the webinar is recorded, and obviously we will post tomorrow on the Deep Crawl blog a full review of obviously the whole piece. Things will be going out on Twitter as normal throughout the presentation, and obviously we'll send an email out to everybody that's signed up tomorrow to the link to the DC blog, and obviously a recording of the whole webinar. And obviously, please, 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 at the end of this webinar, as normal, there will be a survey. Literally takes a few seconds to fill in. We do love the feedback. We'd love to know what you liked, what you disliked. We'd love to know about new people that you'd like to hear from in 2020, because I can't believe we're virtually already through 2019 and one more webinar to go after this one. Let us know who you'd like to hear from. Let us know what you'd like us to present on. There's so many topics that we've covered in 2019, and we're very much looking forward to going into 2020 with some fresh ones for you. So, without further ado, I would love to hand over to Michelle Robbins for the next 30 to 35 minutes on clicks, conversions, and crawls. And please get those questions ready for Michelle, because this topic I'm absolutely certain will throw some up. Thank you very much, and over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, John. And good morning, everyone, or rather, depending on where you might be in the world, good afternoon. Thanks for joining the webinar today. As John noted, I'm the Vice President of Product and Innovation at AimClear. We're an integrated digital marketing agency where we bring the Tao of complete brand creative, data, and integrated performance marketing to all of our client partnerships. I oversee data operations and MarTech for the agency, working cross-functionally with DevOps, AdOps, and marketing ops. And as John also noted, I've been in tech, search, and digital marketing since the mid-90s. I'm a full stack engineer and analyst. I was formerly the SVP of content and technology for the parent company, Third Door Media, of Search Engine Land, Marketing Land, MarTech, and Search Marketing Expo. I'm currently pursuing advanced studies in data science. I've been doing that over the past couple of years now. I'm a STEM advocate and mentor. I really believe that you can't be what you can't see, so I am all in on working with my younger colleagues, especially female, in the industry as well as in my community. Also, superhero enthusiast, role for DC. And I'm looking forward to discussing with everyone today the hidden opportunities within our own clickstream data. So about that data, so we all know we're drowning in it, right? And this infographic, this information is from 2018. So we're at the point now where it's estimated that 1.7 megabytes of data is being created per person per second. And we also have ever increasing numbers of business data sources to contend with. We've got website analytics data, we've got Google Search Console data, advertising from all of the platforms, Google, Bing, Facebook, Amazon, Snapchat, OTT, I mean, lots and lots of advertising data sources. And add to that all of our MarTech products and the data generated in your CRM, your CSM, CDPs you might be using, as well as data enrichment platforms. So the list of potential data sources is huge. And yet, as data collection has increased, according to a Kantar survey of marketers that was released this past September, confidence among marketers and advertisers in the ability to derive insights from all of this data has decreased. So why do we do it? Why do we gather all of this data? Especially if this is true. If collecting massive amounts of data does not functionally lead us to make better business decisions, what are we getting out of it? And do we ask ourselves that question enough when we start collecting all of this data? I don't know if everyone's familiar with the marketunist, Tom Fishburne. He's pretty funny and does a great job of synthesizing so many digital marketing and technology woes that we all go through. I'm sure we can all relate to this. So the current state of data measurement and analysis is pretty nicely explained here. And the point is really that simply piping data into an analytics program and pulling reports out of those programs does little to derive meaning from the data. You'll note I'm an avid follower of Avinash and his content, and what he says here is 100% on point. Having data and having access to data, or to a nice UI and to reports for the data, really does little to move the needle unless businesses also have analysts that can meaningfully interpret and synthesize that data. So instead of focusing on collecting every data point imaginable and then reporting on every metric possible, we need to focus. And we hear this over and over, right? Measure what matters. Yet how often do we ask to who? Who does this matter to and for what outcome? If the answer isn't immediately the customer, then you may be measuring the wrong thing or measuring something for the wrong reason. And all manner of digital marketers, technical SEOs, analysts, everyone, we're all guilty of this type of bias in measurement and reporting. As an example, in SEO, we are obsessed with page speed, and we should be, right? It's very important. And with getting a page speed score acceptable for Google. And while we know that the byproduct of serving Google is that the user will also be well served, if we focused on the user in the first place, we wouldn't have to worry so much about Google. So if you focus on the user, your actual customer, and not the robots, you'll find that you are actually serving the robots at the same time. And related to this, I've seen a lot of articles and talks that address page speed purely from the perspective of the bots, with the anecdote included about how much in dollars each second of decrease in page load the time is worth. But I rarely hear people talk about customers when they're also talking about page speed. And it seems that many SEOs are not looking at user behavior on their sites to understand and meaningfully measure how users are telling us with their behavior where and when things are failing on our websites. I really like the concept of tracking and identifying rage clicks that are defined here to understand when and with which elements users are likely to exit or bounce or otherwise indicate frustration. And so identifying where specifically rage clicks and similar behavior like cursor thrashing are happening is incredibly actionable and it's responsive to user experience. So I'm not going to dig into the JavaScript code that describes how to do this, but links to this source and the code for it are included in this deck, and the deck's going to be available on SlideShare. So as a note, anywhere where I'm linking to things throughout the deck, you're going to have access to those resources once this gets posted. So to understand our customers and how they're interacting with our sites, are we asking the right questions of our data? Too often, we get hung up on overall metrics and creating nice dashboards that highlight broad aggregate data such as page views, channels, bounce rates, overall conversions, things like that. And in and of themselves, these numbers are not necessarily actionable. So the questions we ask of the data informs the quality of the insights we can derive and the actions we can take in our marketing efforts in response to what we're seeing surfaced in the data. So you can clearly see here how the questions on the left, how many visitors converted, how many returning versus new visitors did we get? These are not very actionable questions. They'll give you a number, but they won't tell you much about your customers, and they don't lend themselves to any specific actions you can take to improve them. The questions on the right, on the other hand, speak directly to understanding how your customers are behaving in different ways, and in answering those questions, you can formulate insights and tactics to improve. So instead, consider asking such questions as, how do visitors who converted behave differently from those who didn't? How do returning visitors behave differently than new visitors? Other questions that are insightful versus merely aggregate are things like, does behavior change based on geographic location? Does organic traffic from Google behave differently than traffic from paid campaigns? Ask questions of the data that can yield measurable actions to be taken. Understanding how users convert or what might be preventing them from converting is the key to increasing conversions and decreasing latency in the purchase funnel. About that funnel, right? So we're always talking about the marketing funnel, the buyer's journey, the purchase funnel, things like that. And we're very used to this funnel concept, even though that we know that the path to purchase these days is no longer linear, right? There's so many channels, so many devices, different touch points involved in customer interactions these days that framing the customer journey as a linear path does a bit of a disservice to both users and marketing teams that are engaged in multi-channel campaigns. It's also why I suggest moving away from focusing as much on whether or not people made it through your prescribed goal funnel in analytics, and instead focus on understanding what your customers did on the site in total, leading to conversions as well as abandonment. Now, in order to do this, knowing a user's path through your site is critical. And of course, not just single users, but those that took a common or similar path, so that audiences, you can group them, and you can group clickstream data that can be analyzed. Being able to drill into a segment of users and see the steps they took throughout your site, including navigation back and forth between specific pages, whether site search was utilized, etc. This is really the best way to surface behavioral data, to get at the data where your customers are literally telling you, here's what we actually did, here's what you thought we might want to do, but here's what we did. Now, some of the basic information that can be understood from path analysis includes whether or not the site architecture is optimized for conversions, right? How the navigation and sub-navigation is utilized, whether or not people are clicking on breadcrumbs, if you're including breadcrumbs, right? Your internal linking structure, how is that impacting the path your users are taking through your site? You can also understand, are there technical problems on pages leading to bounces or exits? Is site search required for customers to find the information they need, or do they just simply find it helpful and use it as needed? But honestly, the real power comes with segmenting users within these paths, being able to apply filters and drill into events that occur on pages during user visits. Now, traditionally, Google Analytics, and while I know a lot of people use a variety of different analytics packages out there, what I'm going to talk about today really does focus on Google Analytics, but any other analytics platform has these similar capabilities. I just know that in our industry, typically everyone is also using Google Analytics, so I'm focusing on that one. And speaking of Google Analytics, traditionally they've not really done a very good job of making this information easy to find, to get into and explore. But recently, they released a new integration called App plus Web Analytics. Now, this new property type was released in beta on August 1st, but in my experience and what I've seen with our various clients and others, not many people have looked into it or set it up in their analytics and are then not taking advantage of the new reporting capabilities. I suspect this is largely due to confusion around its name, because even though app is in the name, you don't actually need to have an app to utilize the new property in Google Analytics. And so before getting into these new reporting capabilities, I want to share a number of resources that you can refer back to once this deck is posted. And as these resources will be available on the deck on SlideShare, I'm really not going to drill into them too deeply here, all of these links. But if you work in marketing data analysis, or you find yourself needing authoritative resources on Google Analytics specifically, highly recommend that you follow Seema and Krista if you are not already doing so. Be sure to take a look at the information on this new property type, the Google App plus Web, as it's continued to evolve since it was released a few months ago. And I'm not going to walk through all of the implementation and setup in analytics, but I want to highlight one part of it that I think is particularly important. It has to do with their new enhanced measurement feature. This essentially lets you toggle the types of events you want captured in your data, and it will automatically track those events. So there's no need to add or update code on site or in Google Tag Manager if you're using Tag Manager. Now you can of course add additional custom events to be tracked, but the basics are automatically logged based on your selections during setup, which is incredibly convenient if you're one of those people like me who perhaps spent days tagging up a site for event markup. Now it's important to also know that this new property does not include all of the reporting that Universal Analytics features. So it's not likely going to replace those reports for you entirely, especially if you regularly use the Insights Intelligence feature. But App Plus Web does offer other significant enhancements and options that hopefully are going to find their way into the main GA platform eventually. Also, it goes without saying that you won't have access to historical data, but only data set up forward in this new property type. So don't remove any existing properties you've currently got set up in your Google Analytics if you decide to set up App Plus Web. And I'm not going to drill into all of the reporting, but something that is pretty interesting and noteworthy is the new analysis section. And this is where things get pretty interesting. So as you can see here in this video, the new exploration reporting option lets you easily drag and drop segments, dimensions, metrics, and create not just reports, but also data visualizations without having to utilize Data Studio. This is all done within the App Plus Web property. And the funnel analysis reports within App Plus Web are really improved dramatically over what's currently available in your standard GA. And here again, you've got more options to create analysis based on segments, dimensions, and metric as compared to what you've got available in your current Universal Analytics funnel analysis options. And circling back to the importance of understanding user paths on your site and your own clickstream data, another area where we have a pretty significant improvement is in the path analysis reports. Let me play this movie for us. And the following new features are not available in the previous user behavior and event flow reports in Google Analytics, but are available in App Plus Web. You can apply filters and segments to your path to narrow down the set of users you want to specifically analyze. You can change nodes, you can change between node types, so each step can be customized to be either an event, and you can select the specific type, or a page or screen view. You can also add up to 10 steps and expand all available nodes on the screen. And super useful, you can explore a user's path across multiple sessions when you expand the path to include an event or a page view from the next session. And all of this is done via a really easy, as you can see here, drag and drop interface. So it's evident that understanding user behavior and how people navigate through and utilize sites on their paths to conversion is incredibly critical, right? We all know that. But now that we've got improved capabilities through the App Plus Web property in Google Analytics, what can we do to optimize, guide, and influence user behavior? What can we do to reduce friction in a user journey on a site? Well, this is where prediction comes in. Now, typically, when we talk about predictive analytics and machine learning and AI, people assume that means big data, data on the scale of Twitter or Facebook, for example. But you can actually apply what's called narrow AI to arrive at useful, actionable predictions with far less data required. So narrow AI describes artificial intelligence systems that are specified to handle a singular or limited task. Some examples of narrow AI include attribution modeling, personalization, an algorithm to more quickly increase and decrease campaign budgets, things along that nature. Avinash Kaushik also suggests that the Insights feature within Google Analytics is a great example of narrow AI in action. Now, machine learning and AI are often conflated, and narrow AI is associated with relatively straightforward machine learning algorithms and not the more advanced artificial general intelligence that we tend to see, in science fiction movies and things along that. True AI requires very large data sets, but for the kind of challenges marketers confront and answers that we seek with our data, we typically have enough data to implement a narrow AI algorithm to address them. For the kinds of machine learning or narrow AI we want to explore when we talk about implementing a model for understanding the user's likely next step in a path, obviously based on their prior steps, which you'd get via your on-site clickstream data, we'd want to look at sequence prediction models. So sequence prediction is pretty much exactly as it sounds. It involves using historical sequence information to predict the next value or values in a sequence. Now, here are a couple of examples of sequence prediction models. They include compact prediction trees and Markov chains. To get reliable predictions, you're going to need a sizable enough clickstream data set with enough common paths being taken by users to predict next steps, as well as a developer or data scientist familiar with Python or R and data transformation and modeling. Not going to get into the weeds on the specifics behind these algorithms and codes because I'm providing the links here for further research and as resources for you or your teams to dig into. But I do want to say it's been great seeing a lot of SEOs pivot recently into leveraging Python for other workflow optimizations. So if you happen to be one of those SEOs who's doing this, you're very much going to want to dig in here. And if you missed it, you might consider looking up the webinar that Hamlet Batista did recently with DeepCrawl. He gets more directly into code in that, and DeepCrawl's own Ruth Everett has published several articles with code resources on how to get started utilizing Python for SEO. But for the kind of work we're talking about here, if you're new to Python or R, you're really going to want to partner with your developers or experienced analysts to execute the experiments. And there's more good news related to the App Plus Web property, which enables access to clickstream data, to your own clickstream data source. You can set up a shell app in Firebase, connect the reporting, and from Firebase, export the row-level data that you'll need for the prediction modeling directly into BigQuery. And all of this can be done without having to be an enterprise user of Google Analytics, which is typically required to get at that level of data. So I know setting up a separate analytics property, deeply understanding path analysis and running a prediction model against user clickstream data sounds like a lot of work, but the benefits are worth it. First and foremost, it's going to enable you to better understand your site visitors. And understanding user behavior via analysis of path behavior is going to enable you to see what's broken in your funnel, determine if you have a content or an optimization problem, enable you to adapt your goals to capture how people actually convert versus how you thought they would. Applying a prediction model to this clickstream data, you could then programmatically intervene and direct users away from what you know are non-converting paths and into paths that have been shown to more likely convert based upon your analysis. Now, in the absence of being able to implement such automated intervention, understanding predictable paths will still enable you to optimize frequent paths, as well as implement an internal linking program designed to lead or keep people on a path to conversion. Now, while I'm ending on talking about how important it is to regularly crawl your site, site crawl is actually the starting point. Site crawls and audits are analogous to user path analysis in that they enable you to understand your site the way the search engines do. And site crawls are foundational to comprehensively understanding how your site is structured and whether or not it's open for business to both searchers and search engines. And it's unfortunately far more typical, and I assume we've all seen this happen, where a business sets up, launches a site or launches a new initiative, has some big new redesign, something like that, and they don't do a crawl, they launch the site, and then once the analytics don't produce the results they expected, they go back and look to see what's wrong and what's going on. So ideally, a thorough crawl is done prior to a new launch. All of the issues that are surfaced from the crawl get fixed, and then once the site is launched, regular crawls and audits are done to maintain site health and usability. Traffic from search engines remains one of the key converting channels for most sites kind of across the board, and visibility in search depends entirely on whether or not your site is optimally set up for being crawled, indexed, and ranked by the search engines. So regular site audits are crucial. And a platform like DeepCrawl is going to help surface problems for both the search engines, things like block pages, 404s, duplicate content, as well as users, things like thin content, poor internal linking, navigation issues. And in order to provide your customers with a conversion path optimized experience on your site, you need to ensure that they can find you in search and that your pages deliver on the experience expected once they do arrive. Crawls are going to help surface all of these things for you. And a site crawl and auditing tool should be part of your overall MarTech stack. It's really no different from an analytics package, CRM, CSM, or any other always-on critical technology. It needs to be a core component of your entire technology infrastructure. Now, here you can see just a very small example of the many kinds of reports that are produced by DeepCrawl, highlighting issues to be resolved to ensure maximum search visibility. And regularly scheduled audits kind of keep you ahead of the problems instead of relying solely on changes in your analytics data to signal that something might be wrong or broken on your site and is preventing or limiting conversions. So the process you're going to want to operationalize internally really is crawl and then optimize, analyze and then optimize, and then crawl again, and we'll all start over. So establishing and adhering to this ongoing process is what's going to set you up for success in both attracting and converting customers. So think about your crawl and regularly crawl your site to surface problems with bots accessing content, surface problems impacting user experience, and surface content optimization opportunities. Once you have all that information, then you're going to set about to fixing any errors surfaced in the crawl, push changes to production, and then of course, after every site change, correction, or edit, you're going to want to analyze those results. And you'll want to understand how your changes impacted not just your top line metrics, but whether or not those changes resulted in significant behavioral change in your customers, right? Did those changes, or did a new launch or a new campaign result with, customers returning more frequently? Acquisition of new customers. Are those customers spending more time on your site than customers previously were? How are they moving through to conversion more quickly? And have the paths that they've taken to conversion changed? All of these are the kinds of questions you'll want to be regularly asking during your analysis. And based on your analysis, you're going to want to further optimize. You're going to want to understand, is the optimal user path predictable or able to be segmented and predicted? And the site further optimized towards those conversions paths. You're going to want to rerun your sequence prediction model and make any needed site modifications based on the information you see. We should assume that as our campaigns change, as our market fit changes, as our products change, the behavior in response to those changes is also going to change from our customers. So none of this is ever a one and done initiative, right? You're always analyzing your data. You should always be optimizing towards what you're surfacing in that data and crawling to ensure that the site is maintaining maximum usability and user experience. And then again, optimizing. So again, you crawl, you optimize, you analyze, and then you begin the optimization process all over again. Just want to leave us all with understanding that the web is not static, so your strategy shouldn't be either. And you should always be optimizing toward customer experience specifically. That is all I have for this morning. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I look forward to answering any questions. And please do reach out to connect with me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michelle. Great content, and thank you. As I say, I mean, you keep referencing morning. Obviously, we're over in the UK and we're calling towards the end of the day and it's going dark, but we did get out of bed very early today, obviously on the west coast of America, to do this for us. So very much appreciate you taking the time and the great content as well. We have some questions, which is wonderful, as always. And we're going to dot around a little bit, but I'm going to start with a data question. Jeff Smith's asked the question of what is a sizable enough data for sequence prediction models? That's quite a mouthful. And so, certainly for me it is. Just you talked about a sizable enough amount of data, and just wondering, can you put a number on that, or does it vary by vertical, or because obviously when you think about other marketing streams, finance, you maybe don't need as much data as you need in retail or so on. Is that the same case for this sort of thing? So over to you.
Well, yeah, so you're going to be looking at, it really is traffic dependent, right? Because that's what you're analyzing. You're going to be analyzing your traffic. And if your site does not, or you're working with a site that isn't getting a lot of traffic, it's going to be very hard to get anything other than anecdotal information about what's happening when you look at applying that traffic analysis toward a prediction model. And you're going to need a lot of data, more so over a time series than necessarily one point in time. Like you're never going to want to say you're never going to want to look at a week's worth of data unless it was something like the week that included Black Friday and Cyber Monday. That obviously is going to be very interesting data to look at, and people are probably going to have more of it around that time. But you want to have, I mean, I can't give a specific number, but if you're only getting 500 unique visitors a month, it's going to be very hard to determine, unless that's incredibly static, right? You could form a prediction around the most common path those 500 people take, if there is one, right? Because what could end up surfacing if you're using a very small amount of data, and depending, it also depends on how you segment that data, right? So it's not just looking at your global traffic, it's what is the important traffic to you, and is it people coming from a specific geographic location? Is it people interacting with a specific product, right? Because you could have thousands of products, and if you want to optimize towards a certain vertical within those, you know, a certain category, you could segment the data that way. So it goes to, it's how much you want to segment versus how just kind of general you are, and that's going to depend on the kind of site you are, like you mentioned, John, the vertical that you're in. And you'll be able to understand if you're working with an analyst and developer on this, once they put the data through, you'll understand if this is anything you can make any assumptions with or not, right? Obviously, err on the side of as much data as possible.
No,
and you're also going to want to factor in, when you're doing things like this, factor in things like seasonality. If your industry is impacted by seasonality, understand that you know, control for things like, because a lot of people don't understand how to look at web data, and they tend to look at it in a silo. And so let's say you ran a Super Bowl commercial. You're going to have a giant spike in web traffic around that commercial, even though that wasn't a digital campaign that you can track.
Hopefully you are, because obviously you know how much it costs for a Super Bowl commercial. I'm going to hope that I'm sure the companies that buy them are going to want to know that the traffic came.
Sure. But if you're looking at year-over-year data, and you're looking at a year that includes something that significant or something that was that big, that's going to really heavily bias that data. So working with your other agency partners and understanding what's happening offline as well as online, what's happening in market, if there was a specific, if there was weather, I mean, there are all sorts of things that once you start looking into this data, you're going to want to be able to understand and control for, to get at the most accurate representation of how and when people have interacted with your site.
No, absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think we're kind of answering this question, but I'm going to put it out there because it's from a certain person called Frank Watson, who, if it's Frank Watson, I'm presuming it's the one that we both know. This is the question, obviously, to yourself. Do you reckon, he's obviously on the other side of the world as well, so it just shows we're covering the world tonight.
We are.
Do you recommend segmenting efforts for a site with over 10 million pages, it's like -7 million products, so not like news or content?
Yeah, absolutely. You would have to. Otherwise, you're not going to actually, without segmenting that out by, I mean, if it's got 7 million different products, right? Is that what you said? So if it's got 7 million different products, I don't know how many categories that filters down to. So what you'd want to understand is, first of all, how people are coming in and where they're going, and within specific categories. I mean, pick a place to start. You can't just, you know, throw it all at once and try to get some meaningful information, because depending on what people are looking for, they're going to take radically different paths, you know, depending on how your site is architected as well. So I would say with traffic on that scale, definitely segment and narrow, and see what the data tells you. It's interesting because this kind of work specifically is about seeing what the data tells us, not going into it with this is what we think, so let's see if we're right. It really is about, tell us what's happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more on that. Hi, Frank, by the way. So next question comes from Anna Henry, and she's asking the question, can you share some top tips for use case for Python and SEO? I mean, you mentioned obviously Ruth Deep Crawls wrote a nice paper on it, kind of thing, and we've done a webinar on it as well, kind of thing. But is there anything from your point of view that would be some, you know, top tips or use cases for obviously implementation of Python within SEO, or, you know, is there certain areas where maybe you would just kind of say, just don't waste your time, don't go there because you don't need to, kind of thing?
I think that scale is the first thing you have to address. Like, do you have a scale problem where you're working with content and sites that are so massive that your biggest challenge is scaling your efforts? Because utilizing any kind of automation, whether it's Python, whether it's a platform, whether it's any kind of tool, you're going to want to use that to address a scale problem. it's there. It's not going to fix a marketing problem, right?
Absolutely.
So there's really, it could be anything. It could be if you've got a site that has, you know, 3,000 images without alt tags. That's a challenge that no one should tackle manually. So using Python to tackle that problem, to classify and tag those is perfect, right? Um, I'm a little less inclined to do it. I know that there have been some tutorials put out there with respect to, I think, meta tag creation or things like that. If I'm remembering that correctly, not as
Yep.
much a fan of that because I think content is really, really important and can get it can go wrong, right? And if you don't actually have a great data set or haven't got a really well trained model, then you could produce some really bad content using it. So I would err on the side of anything that involves scale and can help you execute faster. And that's where Python really comes in. And a lot of what Hamlet has shown and what Ruth has shown, it really is addressing problems of scale. If you don't have scale problems, you don't need Python as a solution, right? And you're probably better off spending time and effort focusing on, fixing, any broken marketing issues, analytics issues, things like that.
Very true. No, I think I absolutely agree there. I think scale is the answer, and I agree with Michelle. And it's just interesting to see the different thoughts that people have around it, kind of thing. But as you say, it's the scale and automation piece that Python can bring to the table is very, very compelling.
Yeah, and not just Python. I'm a fan of using any product, any technology, any machine learning, if it's going to reduce the amount of I, I guess we'd call it drudgery work, right? um, Let the machines do what the machines are really good at, because then that frees all of us to do the things that the machines are not good at. And the machines are not creative. They're not good at being creative. They're not good at the kind of analysis. They're good at surfacing information, but they're not necessarily good at analysis of that information. And that's where we as marketers need to be spending our time, in creation and analysis.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think you touched on tools briefly there. So I'm just Jane Smart asked a question, which I was going to ask a little bit, but now we're kind of into the tools bit and we're talking about it. Um, Obviously, we're talking about quite a breadth of different things here across the subject. And she was just wondering, what tools would be best to use? What tools would you recommend for doing these different things? Obviously, you touched on GA and you talked about crawling and deep crawl. But is there a certain like Michelle Robbins tool set that you kind of go and look at these? These are fantastic. I love them. Kind of set of tools to use.
Well, so if you're talking specifically about getting into Python, understanding Python, Python Anywhere is a great tool to get you jumping into notebooks and doing some of the Python work that needs to be done. But prior to that, what you really need is a good database and a good data model. That's more important than anything in any particular tool. BigQuery, I'm a big fan of BigQuery. It's if you're dealing with the amount of data and types of data that you're going to want to be doing interesting experiments with, you're going to need to be working outside of Google Analytics directly, obviously. And a big fan of BigQuery. I would just say BigQuery, SQL, TextPad. Those are the tools. Seriously, those are the tools I use most often. It's a database and it's TextPad, and then Python Anywhere. There's a lot of different Python tools out there, actually. And tools to get you really quickly up and running. Anaconda, it's going to depend on what your use case is, but most importantly, you got to get the data right first, and data access and data model set up in a way that you can then start manipulating it and start running the kinds of queries against it that an out-of-the-box tool is not going to necessarily get you there. So what's more likely is you're going to, whatever platform you're using for your analytics, you're going to be needing to connect via API to get that data out and into a large database structure in the cloud, like BigQuery.
Okay, no, it's interesting just to hear the different views and stuff. I love how everything always tends to boil back towards TextPad. Everybody just loves TextPad.
It's what I've always used. I mean, we're the old guard here.
That's true.
Yeah. I know people are fan of Coda and a lot of other, and I've used it, and I just always find myself opening TextPad.
No, well, if it works for you, then why change? At the end of the day, that's how
We
I
go to
always
what
look
we
at
know.
things.
Yeah,
Precisely. That's a great way of putting it. We go to what we know.
yeah.
And just touching back on the GA piece as well, Mike Holbrook's just asking the question. You mentioned how path analysis and obviously funnel analysis have improved, and obviously this, it's very clear to see that in the way that it's implemented now within GA and the way that present the data. Can you share more on how, what has improved and what functions that people should kind of dial into in some respects that are the new kind of improved areas to look at? Because obviously, as you say, it's been around for a little while, but things have got better.
Oh, yeah, you're gonna really just want to dig into it and start playing with it, to be honest, because the biggest improvements are the ability again to just drag and drop segments and create segments, apply specific metrics, look at specific events on pages within these segments you create. Um, it really is all about the ability to more finely slice and dice what you're looking at. I think that if you use path analysis in regular GA much, you get very frustrated very quickly with a limitation about what you can tell. You're like, okay, well, this looks great, but what do I make of it, right?
Agreed.
The new App Plus Web allows you to dig in the way you want to dig in, without having to be running SQL against a database, for example, right? And then being able to, I would say even more powerful than that, just from my perspective, because the way that I use data and handle data is the ability to then connect to those to that row level data, to pipe it into a database where you can run queries against it, run any queries you want, and segment the data any way you want. But within the new interface itself, it's just really significantly more powerful to dig into those paths and what's happening within those paths, literally on page, as well as across sessions. That's a big one too, being able to connect sessions.
Okay, no, that's a really good point. Actually, being able to do that across the session piece. No, fantastic. And Anthony White asked the same question in some respects as well. So obviously, we're not going to answer it again. But it was more with a tint towards how do you then take obviously that path to conversion analysis, and you touched on it a couple of times through the presentation, and then start to think about it from an SEO perspective.
Right.
Obviously, that path to conversion can involve obviously certain landing pages, but then obviously
Sure.
how do they funnel them through the site? So how do you take that data, which is that real kind of important, juicy stuff that is
Right.
driving ROI, and how do
Right.
you then relate that to the work that you do in SEO, if that
Yeah.
makes sense?
No, absolutely. So this goes to where you can, surfacing how people are actually using your site versus how, and I got into this a little bit where I said, we set up goals and funnels thinking this is what the user's going to do. They're going to click here, they're going to click here, they're going to click here, and then conversion, right? But that's not necessarily how people actually behave, right? They could click here, they could go click on nav, they could come back, they could go back and forth, they could not find what they're looking for and utilize site search. I think site search and what happens within site search is often also a critically overlooked element. And looking at how people go through paths from page to page and back and forth will tell you they're looking for something and they're not finding it, right? So how can we get them to finding what they're looking for more quickly? So if you can see someone going from the home page to a product page to an item in the navigation to the search function, right, the search bar, and what have they searched on, right? And did that lead them to what they were looking for? Then that can tell you that we're making it too hard for the user to find what they're looking for. And is it a problem with the navigation? Is it a problem because there's no internal linking, right? Internal linking is also one of those things that I don't think people, I know that SEOs focus on, but I come across a lot of clients and brands and things like that and have worked with them in the past where you're like, why are you making it so hard for people to find this information? Why aren't you linking? You're talking about this. Why don't you just link to it? Well, we've got
Yep.
the button up at the top right. It's like, I don't want to do that. I'm sure you remember the Eisenbergs in our industry. They're user experience guys that have been around for as long as we've been around. And
Absolutely.
I always remember one of the first talks I saw presented from them where they said, navigation exists where content fails. And if your content is serving the user, then they don't need to use your navigation, right? And I think that's a really important piece of this. So being able to analyze the click stream is going to tell you, did this person want, because sometimes we think, oh, look at how much time they spent, look at how many pages they looked at. And we don't think of it in terms of, are they frustrated? Are they looking for something they're not finding? And how can we
Yeah,
help them
yeah.
find that quicker, right? So for me, the exciting thing about doing these kinds of experiments is then going back and looking at your architecture, looking at your internal linking structure, looking at your content itself, and thinking about, okay, we know that most people that and land on this page convert by doing this next thing. So what can you set up programmatically on that page to help them get there, right?
Agreed.
What can you say? They came through this path, if it's basically an if then, if they came through this path, then send them here next, or change this content to change this link to be that link. There are so many things you can do with SEO by having this kind of data and understanding how the users are using it to better optimize sites for conversion.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it's, as you say, it's coming back to like all the things you just mentioned there in the last bit, the things that make a difference, just doing them and doing them right and setting the foundations and, making sure that the work that you do is built on strong structure that you can then go on and actually be clever with things and change things up and do the other things that we're talking about as well. But it's just getting the basics and doing them well,
Right.
and building the foundations.
Yeah, and the good news is we don't have to be shooting in the dark here, right? We can do this kind of analysis. We have the tools. We have, if you've got enough of the data, and even if you don't have huge amounts of data where you can, necessarily really reliably predict path, and you don't want to risk, I mean, you can still do this kind of experiment, but then decide, well, it looks like this, but if we don't feel confidently about making that change, that's okay. You're still going to surface changes you can make, right? You don't necessarily have to control the path of the user. But I think that understanding are we getting in our own way? I don't think we think about that very often. Like, are we getting in the way of this user doing what they came here to do with all of the things that we think are important for that user to do?
No, absolutely agree. Which kind of leads quite nicely into just thinking about what they need to do kind of thing. Suzanne Wright's kind of come in and just asked, you mentioned a lot of things to crawl and to optimize. I mean, there is an endless in the deck. There's so many helpful things to think about. You virtually call it 101 things you should think about before you start doing these sorts of things. Suzanne's basically just asking the question, where do you start? I mean, we've kind of talked in some respects about, just asked about starting and where do you focus, but obviously we've kind of just talked about some respects the focusing bit. But then
So
when you've got all of this, where do you begin?
yeah,
Kind of thing.
yeah. I think you have to pick a place to start, right? Instead of looking at it as, we're going to optimize every path, pick one, right? Pick one, as we were talking to Frank, pick a category to optimize for, pick a conversion point to optimize for. Like if you have multiple products or multiple services or multiple, it's easier, honestly, if you're just selling one thing. If you're selling one thing, this is so easy. Many of us most are not, right? Most are not. But pick one place to start. And I would say before doing anything with respect to, diving into clickstream analysis and prediction models and things like that, make sure you've got your fundamentals right. Make sure that you've done a really comprehensive crawl. You have fixed all of your, technical debt. Make sure that you're really well optimized from a platform perspective, because you could get into confounding variables, right? Once you've gotten that down, it's really well optimized, and everything is functionally working. So I would first take a look at the data. As what are the users telling us are problems, right? Let's do a crawl. Let's look at how users are interacting with different elements across the site. Are people really heavily using site search for specific terms? That's probably content we're not doing a very good job surfacing, right? Get all of those things fixed, and then after that's been fixed and optimized, 30 days later, run a new analysis. Take a look at, okay, we know everything is fixed. We know we've gotten all of, the crawl, all the buttons work, all the navigation works, everything's working, speed's good. We're pretty well indexed by the search engines. Now what are users telling us that we need to change? So I would start with the fundamentals and then pick a conversion point that you want to focus on.
No, that's fair and good advice for sure. And you touched on crawling there just briefly. Ian Sizemore asked the question, just you mentioned earlier on the deck, crawling always on. Obviously, it could always be on in some respects.
Right. Yeah.
But then, and rightly so, he's kind of saying, well, how often and when is probably a good way of putting it in some respects. Just would you have a view on, how often you should be crawling, and then obviously is there times when you definitely need to, kind of thing.
I would honestly, anything that you do monthly, you should crawl monthly at a minimum, right? A lot of it's going to depend on how frequently your site is changing. How many chefs are in the kitchen on the site, because what I have seen often is you've got a lot of different stakeholders managing different areas of a site, and that can be really tricky to keep track of, because things could happen that you are just literally not aware of. True story. I was one time contacted because the site speed on a property that I oversaw had just tanked. It was just really, the page was loading really, really slow. And they were like, what's going on? Why is our site so slow? And in digging into it, there was a marketing person who had uploaded an image that on the page rendered at, I think, 125 by 125, right? It was 6 megabytes. It was a 6 megabyte image that they did not compress. They did not, they just, it'll be resized automatically. And we didn't have any insight into that when that happened, right? And you change a lot of processes after something like that happens. I promise you. So
I
a
can
lot of
imagine.
it
Yeah,
is,
I'm sure somebody died. Somebody probably died in the process as well, I'm going to guess.
It's a fun story, right? Like, I think on the dev team we all still have that image somewhere on our desktop as a reminder. Um, so it's things like that, right? So if you have a lot of things like that, if you're working in a CMS where people are constantly changing things, people who are not necessarily technically savvy and don't understand how things relate and connect and can break other things, you're going to want to more frequently do crawls. You're going to need to, because otherwise, unless you've got a great system where things are all happening through Git, things are all, there's one point of understanding about all the development happening on a site or any changes.
Yeah.
You're just going to be better informed if you're doing this regularly. I'm not saying crawl your site every day. Now, if you have an incredibly active site where things are breaking left and right all the time, maybe you do need to crawl it every day. But hopefully, yeah, hopefully you're not working in that situation. If you do a crawl and find a significant amount of problems, then you're going to have to stage fixing those, right? You can't fix everything at once. So after every change, every fix, you should recrawl, even if you can just recrawl that directory or recrawl, that subdomain, or, wherever the changes occurred, so you don't have to, throw a crawler at an entire site. You should do that just to make sure that you're, it really is insurance for you and on the health of the site and what you need to be keeping your eye on.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's key as well, because obviously you could joke about kind of crawling every day, but usually it's big sites that are changing all the time, and the ability to crawl multiple millions of pages on a day-by-day basis is quite tough going. I mean, I've certainly seen sort of larger clients that will do a full crawl of the site once a month, and then, as you say, exactly, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like they launch, maybe it's a consumer news site, so they have they have shopping sections and have a news section, have a fashion section, and so on and so on. And you tend to find that different development teams look after them. So you get the scenario where news is uploading every day, and something in fashion might not change on a week by week basis. But working with the devs, and I know you stressed it a few times today, I couldn't agree more. As SEOs, we should work with the devs, and the devs with the SEOs, and try and get along. Sometimes works. Still working on that process, but having that ability to, if something's in the staging environment, crawl it before you launch it. So then when you do launch it, you know that the impact on the SEO is only going to be a positive experience rather than a negative experience, because speed is key, as you say, and I think the way that things are changing all the time at the moment, with the things that Google are getting up to, it really is important to make sure you stay on top of that and index well, for sure. So I really couldn't agree with you more. We're running out of time rapidly fast here, so I'm going to ask one more question for that's coming kind of thing, because it's kind of like a nice finishing question, and it's kind of, Frederick Bark has just asked the question of, can you kind of, like, everything that we talked about today, it's kind of like this is the summary slide. can you share the best ways to automate all of this? You know, is it something that you can automate all of this? Or, you know, where would you think about bringing these different strands together? Is there a piece of technology that you would say, well, look, you're doing all these different things and you could bring it into this one environment and, you know, help you either, you know, gain valuable insight or visibility into everything that's going on across the different tools? And if you can do that, where would you do that? And if you can,
and
where would you automate it?
Why am I not? And if I can, why am I not a billionaire?
Let's build a tech company. Come on.
Well, that's really the tough part, right? Because I've yet to see in any situation, just because it's not the nature of how technology works, right? Things happen and change all the time. People adopt new platforms, old platforms. You've got legacy, custom built systems to deal with. It can be a really hard thing to wrap your head around and get everything working together in such a fashion that you can connect to literally every piece and pipe it into one thing. You can absolutely create workflows where you can, obviously you can automate the crawls on the back end and then piping that information out, or the information that is most critical and important, into a database or another system that aggregates all of these kinds of things. I am not thinking of it at the moment, but there are a couple of platforms who literally this is what they exist for, and it's for gathering all of your data sources, all of your information into one place, right? Data lake or data warehouse, whatever you want to call it, and being able to look at it with a relative ease. Because that's where the rubber meets the road. So automating these things running in the background, running a crawl, obviously analytics are happening in the background. Automating those things is easy. It's the analysis that you can't automate, right?
Yep.
Because if you were to set everything up to, let's say we could create a platform, and John and I are the billionaires of this platform, where we connect everything, and then everything then gets piped back into a feedback loop where changes happen or things are optimized. You're really giving away a lot to a machine and really hoping that your data is right and that there's not some anomaly somewhere and there's not bias introduced somewhere. So I'm not a fan of 100% automating everything. I think the automation needs to stop when the analysis needs to come in, because that's what we need to do. We need to be able to look at things and understand what they actually mean versus what the data point is. So I think that's where you can automate all of the back end happening and hook these things up so that even if you had a really good prediction model and you had a good data set, that you could automate those kinds of things happening. Absolutely. However, you don't want to necessarily automate feedback back into your site for changes, because you could have a data problem that you're not aware of without looking at the data.
Perfect.
That makes sense.
It really does. Great answer. I was hoping for that enlightening moment, but I pretty much probably knew what the answer was going to be. But yeah, no, it's fantastic. Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Obviously, a massive thank you to you, Michelle, for joining us from the West Coast and presenting some amazing information and data. Obviously, we're sharing the decks out and stuff like that, and obviously it's generated some great questions. It's been amazing to sit here and chat them through with your good self. So thank you for taking the time to do this for us, Michelle. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Anytime. And obviously a massive thank you to all of you guys that have joined again, whether it's your first time or you join us on a regular basis for the webinars. As mentioned, the webinar is recorded and it will be online tomorrow on the Deep Crawl blog. We'll do a full summary. Obviously, there's been tweets going out as we've been discussing this for the last hour, but please obviously tune into the DC blog tomorrow and pick up the full summary. And obviously we'll email out to all everyone that's signed up for the webinar, obviously the decks and the recording and all of the different pieces like we always do. Please, 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 before as you sign off, do fill in the survey. We'd love to get your feedback. We always appreciate hearing from you guys and understanding whether it's been good, bad, or different, and things that we could change up or things that you'd like to see in the future for sure. Our next webinar is, with it being Christmas coming soon, and obviously it's the 4th of December already, we're squeezing 2 into December. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time on the 18th of December with another amazing presenter, Mrs. Dawn Anderson, who will be presenting on understanding natural language processing and obviously Google BERT and how that falls into things for search intent. So a very interesting topic again as well, just before Christmas. So please do get signed up and join in for that one. So without further ado, thank you again, Michelle. Really appreciate have a great day on the West Coast as you start the day over there, as we start to finish the day over here and it's completely dark. But thank you very much for attending, and thank you to everybody again. My name's John Myers. It's been a pleasure to host you all again, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you, everybody.